All right, beautiful but foggy day here in Golden Gate Park. I'm thinking of making something of the scene behind me. Here is the inspiration. I'm thinking of keeping it really simple today. Probably go with a high horizon, but just basically focus on the trees and the reflections. That's it. I'll be painting on a 24 by 36 inch stretched canvas, and I will be using my usual limited palette of colors. I've got cadmium yellow lemon, cadmium yellow medium, titanium white, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and phthalo blue. All right, I've thinned some burnt sienna with odorless mineral spirits, and I've got a number 4 natural bristle flat here. First question is, where do I want the horizon, or in this case, the water line? And I am going to go with just above the midpoint, so that I'll have slightly more space down below the water line than above. And for a canvas like this, I use a straight edge for horizons just because it's very difficult to keep a line straight when it's this large. Quickly sketching out the shape of the trees and also their reflections in the water, which are just basically a mirror image. The difference will be that the edges of the trees, the actual trees, will be harder edges, and then the reflected edges will be softer, but the shapes are basically the same. I've got a dark mixture here of ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson, and I've switched over to a number 6 natural bristle flat. The water line is the darkest value in the painting, and I want to make sure that I establish the fact that the foreground trees have a lower water line than the distant trees. Also, the value of the distant water line will be slightly lighter. I may have to darken the water line in the foreground, but I do want to establish the water line before I start blocking in the trees. All right, I mixed up a warm green here using ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow medium, a touch of burnt sienna, and some titanium white. And my palette is a mid-tone gray, so you can see the value of this is slightly darker than a mid-tone. I've thinned the paint with odorless mineral spirits. I am not using liquid today. When I'm painting on a canvas, I just thin with odorless mineral spirits and scrub on the paint. When painting on a panel, I like to use liquid because it helps the paint bind to the panel. But when painting on a canvas, the paint soaks in, so it's not really a binding problem. There will be variations within these shapes, but for now, just establishing the design. For the distant trees, I've added some titanium white and ultramarine blue to the mix. Lightening the value and cooling off the color will push these trees into the distance. This is known as atmospheric perspective. So I could possibly lighten these trees a bit more, but this is a good starting point. Atmospheric perspective allows you to create depth. Morning fog is a key feature here in Golden Gate Park. And I'm using a number 8 natural bristle flat at this point. Switched over to a number 10 natural bristle flat. And for the reflections of the trees, I am lightening the value and also desaturating the color. Reflected objects tend to be less saturated, and they tend to be slightly lighter in value. This might be too light, we'll see. One of the keys to a successful painting is keeping the composition simple, and that's one of the nice things about painting on foggy days. It just simplifies the scene for you, eliminates detail, and it makes it easier just to focus on the big shapes. Now putting in the reflections of the distant trees. I'm noticing that the values between the reflections of the distant trees and the reflections of the trees in the foreground are not that different in value. It's a very delicate value shift. Decided to put a big eucalyptus right here just so that the line of eucalyptus in the background is not such a straight line. I think it'd be nice to have one that kind of bumps up. And then also one where some of the tree trunks are visible. And I may do that with some of the other trees as well. You know, create some sky holes in here. I already need to squeeze out some more white paint. For the sky, I'm starting with a mixture of titanium white tinted with ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson. The sky is the lightest value in the painting, and it's sort of a grayed down purple color. One of the things I like about painting here at Blue Heron Lake in Golden Gate Park is that I get to talk to a lot of people. Somebody just walked by and said, "Wow, that's ambitious," referring to the size of the canvas. And I don't think so. It's actually not that bad because the shapes are very simple. And it's sort of a simple idea I'm trying to communicate here. And so it's not really a problem. In the past, when I paint on foggy days, I would paint small because I didn't have faith that the painting would turn out. But what I've learned is that a larger painting has a different presence than a smaller one. And there's no way to get the same effect on a small canvas. It's hard to communicate through video, but a canvas that's 2 feet by 3 feet, it just has more visual impact than, say, like an 11 by 14. So as I mentioned, the sky is the lightest value in the painting, and then the water is slightly darker in value than the sky. So I've got a slightly darker mix here for the reflected sky, and it looks like I might have to darken it a bit more. We'll see. At this point, I'm trying to cover the canvas. Colors and values are relative. I can't accurately judge colors and values until the whole canvas is covered, and then I can begin comparing the values and colors to the surrounding colors and values. And the reflected sky in the foreground is actually darker, so it will be darker down at the bottom and then get lighter right at the top of the trees here. That might be a bit too dark, we'll see. All right, the blocking is complete. I've stepped back about 20 feet just to look at the overall composition. I think I want to keep some of the red on the water line here, just to get some red into this painting. So I am going to reinforce the water line, but I'm going to try to leave little hints of the red. I'm noticing some dark shapes along the water line here. So now that the composition is established, I can create a little bit of detail, but again, paying attention to the value shifts here, trying to keep them delicate, and I can step back periodically to see if I'm breaking up the composition too much. And it looks like I'm okay. As I said before, a good design is essential for a successful painting. And so once you've got that design, you want to make sure that you don't lose it. Sometimes we can get focused on the details and lose sight of the overall design. That's why it's important to step back as much as possible. I feel like these trees in the foreground need to be darkened slightly, just to create a little bit more separation from the trees in the background. Now that the canvas is covered, the values are easier to judge. It became obvious to me that the value of these trees in the foreground needed to be slightly darker to create a convincing feeling of depth. I used to spend a lot of time trying to be accurate during the scrub-in process, only to end up painting over the colors and values that I labored over. So I decided that it was time wasted in a way, time and energy wasted. So now I try to quickly cover the canvas or panel so that I can start focusing on adjusting the colors and values while I still have energy to do so. I'm adding some darks here, but I want to make sure that the darks aren't too dark because I don't want to lose the fog effect. These darks are dark compared to the surrounding values, but they are actually close to a mid-tone. They're not very dark. I don't know if you can see I'll show up close. And they're also transparent, so they have a more delicate look to them, which is what I'm after. I'm also conscious of the way I break up the shapes. In other words, I try to break up the shapes with other shapes and not just a bunch of random value shifts. So the idea is that hopefully adding these other shapes within the shapes, it creates a little bit more definition, but it doesn't become too busy and distracting. There are two layers of trees in the distance. There are the trees right along the water line, and then there are the distant eucalyptus trees. And so I want to indicate these trees along the water line, but I want to make sure that these background trees stay in the background. So I'm keeping the value shift between the two very delicate. I decided to experiment by adding a light blue-green above these trees just to create a little more separation. Maybe some light on the tops of the trees too. I can suggest some sky holes in the trees as well. Adding a little bit of alizarin crimson to the mix. Always trying to sneak red into the painting whenever I can. All right, so here's a close-up of the distant trees. So there is a variety of colors and values, but a fairly narrow range of colors and values. I decided to define the distant water line, but I think I went a bit too dark. I want to create definition, but I do not want this distant water line to feel like it's too far forward. I want to maintain the feeling of depth. So I'm going over it with some titanium white just to lighten it up a bit. And I'm also going to create some variation along this line so it's not just a straight line. I'm adding some warm bits to the top of these trees here. Adding some phthalo and cadmium yellow lemon. There's some greens in the foreground that have a bit more blue in them. All right, so here's what I finished up with. This painting took just under 2 hours to complete. It was finished on site. The goal with this painting was to create a convincing feeling of fog and atmosphere, and also to have a nice composition. And what I mean by that is to have a nice arrangement of simple shapes. I also like having expressive brush strokes in my paintings. And I found that in this particular scene, having some visible brushwork in the trees worked out, but I decided to keep the brushstrokes in the sky and the water somewhat subdued, just because I did want to create a calm effect in this painting, and by having visible brushstrokes in the sky and the water, it would have disrupted that feeling of calm. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and got something out of it, you might want to subscribe and like the video. Somebody mentioned in the comments that they're not getting my videos. I've had several people say that, so by subscribing, you'll make sure that you don't miss any of the videos that I post. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, there's a Patreon link down below, and there's also a PayPal tip jar. Check it out. Other than that, stay creative. I'll see you guys in the next video.